Well, hello everybody, and welcome to another YouTube lecture video. This one's going to be on the Mexican-American War, and I don't think I have any videos on this over the last 4 or 5 years, so this would be a first. I think. I could be totally wrong. I haven't looked. Shame on me. So let's go ahead and get into this lecture. So get out your key concepts for period 5, because we're going to get right into it. Now, period 5 tells us right here in 5.1, the United States became more connected with the world, right? The United States is starting to get sort of closer towards a world influence. We're still kind of an agrarian experiment, but we're starting to get into this expansionist thought. We're getting more involved in a little bit of a foreign policy. We're still isolationist, but there are some loopholes that we're starting to find at this time period. The United States really wants to start to dominate the Western Hemisphere. If you remember from period 4, you had the Monroe Doctrine. Although not breaking isolationist policy, it still was America trying to slowly assert itself in the world. So here in 5.1, Roman numeral 1, we see popular enthusiasm for the United States expansion. We're looking at economic growth in America. The market revolution is still going on. We're thinking of security interests. Right? The result in acquisition of new territories. Well, how are we going to acquire these things? Can you say war? Yes, that's how we're going to do it. Substantial migration westward. So all of this heading west. We're going into the Louisiana Territory finally. And we're fulfilling what is going to be known as America's manifest destiny down there in letter B. These are all extremely important to Americans at the time period. It is that manifest destiny that pushes us not just into Louisiana, but eventually into Texas and to all the way to California. This idea that it's America's destiny to control the entire continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, right? We're looking for opportunities. Some are coming for economic opportunities, some for religious refuge. Still coming from Europe, a lot of immigrants are coming. They're going to take advantage of this manifest destiny. This is an interesting picture here, actually painted in 1872, but there's a lot of things in this particular painting that are very symbolic. But we see the goddess Liberty, this giant white woman marching across the West as she's stringing telegraph wire. She's holding a school book, and she has the crown of empire on her head. Technology, advancement. You notice it's all bright. It's all enlightened where she's coming from into a darkened world where the Native Americans are still, now they're running for their lives. And it's interesting to note in this painting, the only white woman is Goddess Liberty. There are Native American women here. There's also nobody else of any ethnic group here. It's all white farmers, pilgrims, individuals in the train, in the steamboats. All this technology is coming. And this painting kind of tries to sum up at the time period this idea of manifest destiny and what it was. Bringing enlightenment to the West and conquering it. Mexicans and Native Americans are going to have to get out of the way. They're looking for natural and resources. They're looking for mineral deposits. They're going to discover gold and silver and zinc and copper, all these things out west that become very, very important for building what will come after the Civil War, the Industrial Revolution. Also, a lot of farming is going to come out here. And we're going to talk about that a lot later on in class. Many of the immigrants are German and Swedish, and they're coming out here. They're farmers. That's eventually going to lead to one of the greatest man-made disasters in our history. Can you say Dust Bowl? But we'll talk about that later on as well. Just some hints for the future. So staying in this concept, we see in letter C, the Mexican-American War. diplomatic negotiations and things like that are going to be tried. But taking that concept, let's think about what's going on. It's the election of 1844. The Democrats aren't sure who to nominate. Andrew Jackson is still alive, though barely, and he does endorse one of his neighbor's children, this guy, James K. Polk, who was enamored with Jackson. Most historians will tell you that Polk is the bookend of what we call the Age of Jackson. Right, you have Jackson comes to power in the 1820s. Martin Van Buren is in there, and we know how horrible that ended. The Whigs get in there that one time in 1840, but then Polk comes and basically fulfills Jacksonian democratic thought. He was the only president to say he was only going to serve for one term. He promised 4 very specific things. He's going to lower the tariffs. That's what Southerners like, right? That's a very states' rights sort of a deal. We get the Walker Tariff passed in 1846. He's going to bring back the independent treasury. Martin Van Buren tried to do it, but then the Whigs eventually got rid of it. But the Whigs fall into disarray in the 1840s. They tried to stop this, but they're going to lose. And an independent treasury will basically be established all the way until we get the Federal Reserve Bank in 1913. Although we're going to talk a little bit about Abraham Lincoln. I don't know if you ever heard of this guy. He is going to do something with banks, but this independent treasury is still going to be around. And we'll get into that. But again, remember, what this is, the independent treasury, the United States government doesn't put its money in banks anymore. They put their money in the Treasury Department. But the Treasury Department will build these various vaults around the country and be like a sub-treasury where they'll collect gold and silver from all the tax revenue and not invest it back into the economy. Which is why in the 1800s, there's constant periods of economic growth followed by terrible panics or massive depressions that will happen. He promised the acquisition of California. He becomes the first candidate to openly endorse Manifest Destiny, that California should be part of the United States, and that will eventually lead to war with Mexico. Of course, he's also going to talk about Texas, and very specifically, he promises Oregon. 54-40 or fight became a campaign slogan for him. That's the parallel line that would actually bring it up into Canada. Obviously, we do not go into Canada. He will sign a treaty with the British to get Oregon, but he will go to war with Mexico. But we mentioned in class the election of 1844. Young Hickory, by the way, is his nickname because Jackson was Old Hickory. He's going up against a very well-known person. Remember, James K. Polk is a dark horse. He's an unknown candidate. But the Whigs nominate somebody that everybody in America knows. Yes, everybody knows this person, and they really, really love him, supposedly, and they cannot wait till he finally gets his chance to run for President of the United States. Who is that? Well, of course, it's Henry Clay. Wait, no. No booze? No, it's Henry Clay. It's Henry Clay. Yes, there you go. That's what we need for Henry Clay. All right, that was a little bit too long. All right. Yeah, so Clay, this is the last election he will run in, 1844. He can't help but shoot himself in his own foot when it comes to the annexation of Texas. Texas is already declared, as we've talked about this a little bit in class. Texas had its own revolution against Mexico in the 1830s. They became an independent country. But by the 1840s, they want to become part of the United States. They want to be annexed. They want to be taken over and become a state. The one thing that Clay actually does, what we do know about Clay is he is absolutely, really is against the annexation because he knows it means trouble for the United States. The South wants Texas for slavery. The North doesn't want Texas at all because of slavery. And he is so afraid that this will bring nothing but more discourse and eventually war. He had written a letter years earlier where he definitely said, I don't want Texas to come in the Union because right now it's going to be a slave issue. But then he can't stop writing letters, and these letters get published. There's the famous Riley letter, Riley, North Carolina, where he talks about, no, I don't want annexation. Then in order to explain himself, he writes the Alabama letters, where he starts talking about, well, you know, if we can get Texas without war, that'd be a different thing. He's really consistent, but it doesn't sound consistent. It sounds like he's for it, and he's against it. And the Whigs are divided on this. Southern Whigs are slave owners. They would like Texas. Northern Whigs are becoming conscience Whigs, where many of them are becoming abolitionists. I like this political cartoon, The Anti-Annexation Process. You have Henry Clay is writing on what is actually a raccoon, although it looks like a fox. You have what is known as the Hartford Convention Blue Lights. Think about the Hartford Convention Blue Lights. The Federalists who became traitors to the country in the War of 1812. They're shouting, "Save God, save the King," right? So it kind of gives you this idea. This cartoon is obviously an anti-Clay cartoon, anti-Whig. Here is Clay's running mate, this, I can never pronounce his last name, Fragenhausen, Theodore Fragenhausen, something like that. He was a devout religious Protestant. So this is like the Protestant procession behind him. There were Catholics in America who totally believed that the Whigs and Clay were going to bring about a Protestant empire, thereby not allowing Catholics any kind of freedom in America. Then you have the abolitionists behind them. That's William Lloyd Garrison, who we've talked a little bit about, but we're going to talk a lot more about as we get into period 5. He's one of the most vocal of all the abolitionists, right? He is definitely for the abolition of African American slaves, but he is a devout religious person who does not believe that government whatsoever can bring this about. Only God can do it. So it's basically this very thought that the Whigs are basically losing their minds, this kind of political cartoon. And when the letters get out, when they get published, it seems like Clay is for annexation. He's against annexation. If he would have never written letters, just stop writing letters, Clay. But it really comes to bite him back that people say, well, he's a flip-flopper. He doesn't know what he wants. Plus, Irish Catholics decide to vote against him, especially in the state of New York, and he winds up losing New York because of this. I do put the Telegraph in here because this is the first election, the 1844 election, where the election results will be telegraphed. So we will know within hours and within a few days what states voted for whom. James K. Polk obviously beats Clay in this election. It's yet another way of him losing spectacularly in these elections. But we're not done with Henry Clay. He's still going to be around for a little bit, and he has his magnus opus is right around the corner. His great moment of compromise is still yet to come. But as we know, the poor soul is never going to be president of the United States. Although he'd rather be right than be president, right? That's what he always says. Yeah, sure, Clay. All right, let's get back to the key concepts. Let's go back to letter C. Again, this Mexican War. But tells us through diplomatic negotiations. There we go. There's James K. Polk. The only president to rock a mullet, right? All business in the front, all party in the back. Just can't believe a president of the United States had a mullet. He does offer to buy California for $25 million. He sends a diplomatic a group to Mexico to try to avoid war. He offers to buy California. Of course, Mexico wants nothing to do with it. Texas immediately asks for protection from the United States in case Mexico invades them. So Polk orders an army down into southern Texas around the Rio Grande or the Rio Bravo, depending on which side of the country you're on. They're the same river. General Zachary Taylor into this very disputed area. And what happens is anybody's guess. General Taylor is doing military exercises. He's crossing the Rio Grande, the Rio Bravo River, into Mexico, and he's coming back into Texas. He's basically antagonizing the Mexican army. And on April 25th, 1846, Mexican forces attack General Taylor's army. 16 Americans are killed or wounded. Immediately, Polk writes a war message. Actually, he probably already had the war message ready for this very occasion, and he gets Congress to pass the war resolution. Although there's one member in Congress, in the House of Representatives, a young guy by the name of Abraham Lincoln, probably never heard of him. He's a Whig, and he gives a speech in the House where he wants to know the exact spot as to where the Americans were shot at. It's known as the spot resolution. If Americans were attacked in Mexico, Abraham Lincoln argues, then we provoked the Mexicans. If the Mexicans crossed the river and attacked Zachary Taylor in Texas, then it's war. They attacked us. He does not want war unless we absolutely know why this happened. It's actually a very good thought, but he gets laughed at a lot. They begin to call him Spotty Lincoln. Remember, in the House, you only get a 2-year term. He loses his reelection. Abraham Lincoln will go back home defeated, believing that he will never amount to anything and never be in politics again. Oh, poor Lincoln. If he only knew. If he only knew. Yeah, I know. But he's going to become a pretty important person here in a little bit. The war resolution obviously passes, and the Mexican War begins in 1846, and it lasts till 1848. And as you know, College Board isn't going to ask you questions about the actual war. They're going to ask you questions as to what led up to it, what are causes, but especially the effects of the war. This is a war that becomes very controversial in the United States. Why are we fighting the war? Who wants to fight the war? Well, predominantly you should know the South wants this war. They want Texas, which Texas actually has already come into the Union, but they also now want all the way to California. And it's obviously why the South and the Democratic Party wants this. They want to extend slavery to California. The North doesn't want this war at all, basically, at least the majority of the Northerners, because they see this as a slave war. And they see this as a way for the South to gain even more power in Congress. Remember, the 3/5 compromise is still upon us. So there's a lot of controversy to this war. In fact, if we go to 5.2 now, it says intensified by expansion and depending regional divisions, right? Sectionalism, the South versus the North, the East versus the West, debates over slavery and the economy, plus cultural political issues led the nation to the Civil War. This war with Mexico becomes one of the long-term causes that will lead directly to the Civil War. And here in letter A of Roman numeral 2, again, we're in 5.2 now, right? All slavery is now the dominant political issue going into the 1850s. And it's because of the Mexican cession. By the way, the word cession means a legal transfer of land. Legal. How is war legal? Well, because there's declarations made, and then we took it. But we took it through a legal means of war. Yeah, whatever. But it led to heated controversies because of slavery, right? Before the war even gets started, a member of Congress, David Wilmot is his name. His name is David Wilmot of Pennsylvania. He proposes a bill known as the Wilmot Proviso. Proviso is Latin for provision. I don't know if you realize this or not, but war costs money. So they have to pass bills in Congress to become law to raise money. They're known as appropriation bills. In Congress, money is known as appropriation. But in any bill that gets turned into a law, there's always all these add-ons to any bill. So David Wilmot wants to do an add-on, a provision to this war bill, this war appropriation bill, to raise money to fight the war. What does he want? Well, he declares that any land that we may acquire from Mexico must remain free land. We talked about this in class. Some of you were taking your PSAT. You weren't there. But Mexico had its revolution in 1821. They outlawed slavery when they wrote their constitution in 1821. So slavery has been outlawed in Mexico since 1821. That land has been free ever since. David Wilmot decides that land has to stay free. He's not an abolitionist, but he is somebody who's thinking about industry and free labor. We call it free labor, but they're really wage labor. They're wage earners versus slavery. And he doesn't like the idea of that competition. He also doesn't like the idea of slavery spreading into that land. It never passes. It never goes beyond the bill portion. It never even hits the president's desk as a possible law because Congress goes crazy over this. Southerners begin to yell, I told you, they're raising our taxes, they're coming for our slaves. We almost don't even have the Mexican War. There are people in the South who decide maybe we should just fight each other right now. But of course that doesn't happen, and they do go to war with Mexico because the Wilmot Proviso never passes. But it shows that the North is now thinking more about stopping the spread of slavery. And that's going to be an issue that's going to lead to the Civil War. The great Henry David Thoreau. We talked about transcendentalism in period 4. We talked about Henry David Thoreau. He writes a very famous essay called Civil Disobedience. This is what will influence Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1960s. He will say it's okay to tell your government when it's wrong. You must tell your government when it's wrong. He is an abolitionist. He sees the Mexican War as a slave war, and he begins to denounce this war. So you start to see social issues are rising in America now because of the Mexican War. People are starting to draw lines. More Americans are starting to think about abolition. More Northerners are starting to wonder, why is the South wanting to spread slavery? Why is the rest of the world ending slavery, but the United States seems to embrace it? This is going to become a major issue within a decade after this war. Now, it's a war that the United States wins. They beat the Mexican armies pretty soundly, and a Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is signed on February 2nd, 1848. But it's not over. Even though America gets all that land, it's going to constantly lead to problems in this country because of slavery. And we're going to talk a lot more about this in class. Polk, one of the things he promised is that he would not run for a second election. Although he might have thought about it because he becomes very popular by 1848, he's also very sick. He is a massive workaholic. He suffers terribly from dysentery. Dysentery. So he decides not to. But the election of 1848 brings a new thought to American political spectrum, the idea of popular sovereignty. The Democratic Party will now begin to embrace this idea of popular sovereignty. That means you, the voting populace of America, have a right to decide for yourself. Lewis Cass runs as a Democrat. He's the first one to embrace this ideology of popular sovereignty for the Democrats. In all territories, let the people in territories decide for themselves by the vote if they want slavery or not. The Democratic Party will think this is a way to save them as a party. Northern Democrats are starting to question the idea of slavery, while Southern Democrats are embracing it whole-souled. Not only do they want to bring it to California, but there's some of them that want to invade Central America and continue slavery there. That's how much the South is embracing it. Northern Democrats think, well, let's bring popular sovereignty. This will save our party. No, it's going to hasten the Civil War, allowing people to decide slavery instead of your elected officials realizing how morally wrong this is and trying to end it. The Whigs nominate Zachary Taylor. He is a national hero after this war. He is the victor of the War of 1812. He is the hero of the Mexican War. he will win. He'll be the second Whig to win an election. He becomes the second Whig to die in office. The only two Whigs to get elected, William Henry Harrison, who was a general, Zachary Taylor, a general. Both of them died in office. And then the Whig Party will eventually fall apart because of slavery. But the Northern Whigs will eventually regroup themselves into the modern Republican Party. This is the Whig Party. Remember, Lincoln is part of this party. He becomes their first Republican president. I love the political cartoons sometimes of this period. Here's Zachary Taylor, the hero of Buena Vista, but he's sitting on a pyramid of skulls, right? Showing that he was basically a general of death. But Lewis Cass was a general too, right? A war president. He's got a sword that says manifest destiny, dripping blood, right? His whole body is basically made into a cannon, sort of like a cyborg if you think about. And they're calling this progressive democracy because of popular sovereignty. If only they knew what progressivism would eventually become. That's kind of funny. Both these presidents are basically warmongers, but Zachary Taylor will win. But it's going to lead to a very, very, very volatile moment in our history within 2 years of Zachary Taylor's presidentship. But we'll talk about that in class. Although, in our book, you can read about it, 398 to 412. You'll read about the Compromise of 1850. But I do want you to go to page 405, and I want you to answer question number 1, all parts. And I want you to go to page 417 and answer question number 1 again. Again, all parts. And there's a much younger James K. Polk before he had the mullet. And that's a painting. The other one I showed you was actually a photograph or a daguerreotype. All right. Well, I hope this is good enough for you guys. We'll see everybody later on. And if you're watching this late at night, get some rest. Go to bed. Get some sleep. All right. See you later. Bye-bye.